for being with us today. This lunch chat topic was inspired by a recent webinar that we're linking to here on redlining and urban tree canopy. The webinar is one in a series on connecting for conservation by the Salazar Center for North American Conservation. This webinar was great. I've seen a few others in this series that were also great, so highly recommend checking them out. But again, not necessary to be participating today. And this is being recorded, but we'll stop the recording before discussion so that people can speak freely, and we'll have some notes that kind of summarize the ideas shared. So just as some quick background, what is redlining and where are New England's redlined cities? So if you wanted to take redlining in good faith, I think you could say it was a mortgage lending management practice that was enacted through the New Deal with the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. The HOLC's job was to, again, prevent foreclosures, stabilize housing, and to do this, they mapped cities, over 4 dozen cities in New England. They were mapped into different categories, with A being the best, mapped in green, and D being the riskiest category, coded in red to mean hazardous. But the problem was that the criteria used to classify different areas into these categories was openly racist. And this was federal policy under the National Housing Act of 1934, and it remained federal policy until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And to give a sense of the magnitude and impact of this over time, according to the New England Historical Society, between 1934 and 1968 in Connecticut, 98% of federally approved loans went to white non-Hispanic borrowers. So over 3.5 decades, almost complete exclusion of minorities from this important government service. And just to let the HOLC maps speak for themselves, here I'm gonna blow up part of New Haven. This is what the maps actually looked like. And you can see different areas color-coded according to the grade that they received. And the red areas are literally the areas that were formally redlined. But this is what they have to say about this blue area with a star over it in New Haven. They say, this is a newer development of which the architecture is varied and pleasing. Were it not for the fact that this area is entirely Jewish, it would command a higher rating. And then in this section on inhabitants, you see even more revealed about the mentality going into this, like language like infiltration.
Infiltration.
Yeah, it's
wow.
really remarkable. In this case, Jewish people. Relief families means people on welfare or needing government assistance. Foreign-born, Black population, and the type of work that that residents engage in this case, minor executives. So hopefully it speaks for itself on what they were really doing and how that impacted New Englanders. But so the webinar, the Salazar Center webinar, was all about redlining and tree canopy and some other patterns, and we were interested to see if we could see these in New England too. And again, just want to note that redlining is not, there were things that happened before redlining, things that happened after, and certainly this visual analysis can't, determine a causal link, but it's really interesting to see the correlations and patterns. So one of the things they mentioned in the webinar is a pattern just within redlining maps themselves that you can kind of see very clearly in the Hartford one, right here on the left, and also in the Boston one, and to a lesser extent in these smaller ones, which is that the areas that are graded as like better quality tend to be in the west, and the redlined areas tend to be in the east. And one hypothesis proposed in the webinar is that since our prevailing winds blow from west to east, this sets it up so that the wealthier white residents don't need to deal with, the polluted air that is being forced on poor minoritized populations. So if you've ever, maybe observed that there's a pattern with the east side of cities being less well off, that could potentially have something to do with a past policy like redlining. Kind of interesting. But the webinar was really about tree canopy, and we of course had to look and see if we could see this in New England too. So here's Hartford, the Hartford area with the HOLC map on the right here, and the outlines overlaid on aerial imagery. And even from this distance, really far zoomed out, we can see that it's a lot brighter over this middle section where the red and yellow lined areas are, compared to out west with the green and blue lined, where it's a little bit darker, and we even see what look like little straight dark lines throughout, which are trees. And when we zoom in, we can see that, yeah, those are trees. We hardly see any exposed building tops in the green lined and blue lined areas. But as we travel east through the yellow lined and into the red lined areas, there's kind of a loss of canopy and an increase in exposed building tops until you're kind of in this industrial zone. For the Boston metro area, you can see that too. And certainly this pattern doesn't hold everywhere, but it holds in certain places, which is really interesting. I looked at this transect that's circled in black here from Brookline to Boston, because it has a big section of green lined area and a big section of red lined area kind of right next to each other. And I almost feel like if you cut this photo in half, you might not even realize that you were in virtually the same location. The Brookline area, similar to West Hartford, it's darker, you can see the trees. And then in Boston, it's much brighter, lots of exposed rooftop, and the only vegetation is much sparser. And then wanted to show some love to New Hampshire and look there too. And at this gradient shown in white, the area circled in white, we can kind of see the same thing with trees and actually a park adjacent to this green lined area, and then a slow thinning of the tree canopy until in the red lined area you're in this kind of industrial zone is what it looks like. So again, not universal patterns, but they are there for a few cities in New England, which is really interesting. And then since we saw this pattern, I was thinking about how things are connected. I was curious to see if there were correlations with other variables. And so what's shown here is a map from the Opportunity Atlas, which is a really great resource on demographic data from the state to the census tract level. And what we're seeing here is poverty rates in Manchester from 2012 to 2016, with red being higher rates of poverty. And of course, it's not a perfect correlation because this is just one policy out of centuries of history, but it does seem like there's a little bit of a match there, which is really, I hope, just represents and shows how things are connected. So that's how redlining can kind of show up in our cities today. And then of course we have these maps of the future, and we started wondering, well, does it show up in the future too? And so I looked at the Brookline-Boston transect, and I changed the outlines of the redlined areas to white, which is a little confusing, so that they can be seen over the NELF maps. And what we notice is that there's more high density development in the formerly redlined areas. And then in the green-lined areas, it's mostly just low density development. There's very little high density, and there's more forest as well. The same thing holds up for Hartford. This isn't a pattern we can see in all of our cities because there's variation, but it holds true in these two, which is interesting. And then when we think about the future scenarios, we see recent trends in 2060 on the left and connected communities in 2060 on the right, and they look pretty much the same for Hartford. One difference is this green-lined patch over here. Connected communities puts a little more high-density development there, but really they look pretty much the same, and that's for a few reasons. I mean, these maps are meant for different scales, with the HOLC maps being for within a city and NELF maps kind of more for landscape. The categories, low and high density development, each have lots of variation within themselves is another challenge. And then also the NELF scenarios only imagine certain types of change, which I think is the most interesting way to think about this. you know, we picture changes from low to high density development, but we never picture or model changes from high to low density, or, you know, deindustrializing parts of downtown, or what have you. There are certain things that don't happen in the NELF scenarios that might be interesting in the context of the city and redlining. But so acknowledging that there's a lot of variation, two things that we can say about the NELF maps and redlining are that our redlined areas are frequently devoid of any kind of large forested area that we could map at our NELF scale, and that there tends to be disproportionate amounts of high density development. And when we look at, you know, the aerial imagery underneath, like we saw in the tree cover images, we see that it's redlined areas are often industrial or commercial, or they're adjacent to commercial or industrial development. But so then, if the maps were, you know, kind of limited utility, I started thinking about scenarios as ideas, and the NELF scenarios were not developed to create a utopia scenario and a dystopia scenario, and I don't think that's what they are. But if you share certain values, which I'm going to guess that we do since we're here today, connected communities from the options that we have kind of emerges as the preferred future, because it's the one most rooted in valuing the land and centering what local people need. And so and it has all these characteristics that we kind of talked about in the last NELF chat. And so, you know, acknowledging the negative consequences of past policy and thinking about how, for example, new policy, potential policy like the Green New Deal is being talked about and could potentially play a huge role in creating a connected communities future. I think it's worth thinking about what potential this scenario has to exacerbate or alleviate the impacts of redlining or other policies, or just our reality, our current conditions today as an unequal society, and what other considerations are needed or relevant when we think about, you know, the fact that the New Deal actually had a lot of really bad consequences for people, and not trying to repeat that in the future.